settled by the sea. I know your hand is always there to guide me. You are there. You are there. You are there. You are there. Where can I go? Where can I go from your presence? Trouble is in my way. You're already there. You will not go. You will not go from my presence. Word of mine is said. If in the depths I lay my head, in the shadow of your wings, you're there to hide me. You are there. 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 I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got my faith in the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got my faith in the Lord. I'm so glad I've got my faith in the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the love of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the love of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the love of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's working in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's showing in me. I've got the joy of the Lord, and it's plain to see. I've got the joy of the Lord. I'm so glad I've got the joy of the Lord. 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 I've got the joy of the joy. I've got the joy of the joy of the Lord. I've got the joy of the Lord.
The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning.
Welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 15. Today's study will be over material that is of a mature nature, so please be advised before showing this to children. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Masks will be available at the door for anyone who needs one. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes. You're welcome to join us for those. You're welcome to join us in the large auditorium to watch this class on the large screen there. We want to make sure everybody knows we have these English Standard Version Bibles from the World Bible School available for anyone who'd like to have one. If you care to have one, please contact the church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our sick list is quite long, so please refer to our bulletin for more information. We want to keep in our prayers Charles Brazil, April Askew, Kent Gauntly, Brandy Krim, Jake Bentley, Sharon Payton, Jeanette Inman, Betty Smith, Don Jones, Marianne Kinsey, Donnie Glenn Dixon, Jeff Amix's mom, and my friend David Garza. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus. They were joined by a third man while they were on their way. When they got to their destination, the third man revealed himself to be Jesus, the Christ, resurrected from the dead. Then he parted company with them. They recalled after he left that while he had been with them, there had been a burning in their heart. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to call into remembrance the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the story of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. Rehoboam lost control over all the tribes of the kingdom except for Judah because he took bad advice. Jeroboam, on the other hand, had been told while Solomon was still king that he would become king over the tribes that would separate from Rehoboam. And he waited in exile in Egypt until the time that Solomon passed. Then he came back and took control of the northern tribes. And instead of doing as God had advised him to do, which was to obey him and keep his commands, he set up high places in the mountains and told the people that they should go there and worship the God that led them out of Egypt there, rather than going into Jerusalem. This was an abomination before the Lord, not only for Jeroboam, but for all the people who believed Jeroboam. And Jeroboam also set up golden calves as idols to be worshipped in those places, and a false priesthood to facilitate the worship there. Every king of Israel was subsequently considered a sinner before the Lord because they left the high places there. It's a terrible thing to believe a lie. But God didn't just let Jeroboam do this. He sent a prophet. That prophet came to Jeroboam and told him that he was doing wrong. Jeroboam went ahead and did what he chose to do, and then the prophet left. The prophet was met on the way by a prophet from Israel who had heard of his presence there and wanted the honor of his company. So he lied to the prophet from Judah and said, "Come eat lunch with me, the Lord wants you to do this." And the prophet from Judah believed the prophet from Israel and was told almost immediately by the prophet of Israel, who then did prophesy, that his life would be required of him because he had believed a lie. And indeed, as he got up to leave, he was met in the way by a lion and killed. It's a terrible story about the implications of believing a lie. Not just any lie, but a lie that he knew to be counter to what his instruction was. And that's the admonition that we have. We have to make sure that when we believe something as if it has come from the Lord, that it is consistent with what the Lord has told us to do elsewhere. So it is upon us to find out what the Lord has said so that we can know the difference between the lie and the truth when it is presented to us. And it will be presented to us. So that's why we study. We study so that we'll be prepared when that time comes, and we'll know the truth to know whether or not someone is lying to us or whether they're telling us the truth. If I in any way bring to you anything that sounds wrong, inconsistent with what the scriptures say, I hope that you will, number one, and most importantly, believe the scriptures. Don't believe me. And number two, come to me and tell me what I have said that you feel is inconsistent with the scripture. And we will go together and study those things and find out what the Bible actually says about the matter. Perhaps I am wrong, perhaps you're wrong, but please come to me. Let's go together and find out the answer. I hope that you will go with me now as we enter into this study of chapter 15, and that you will be encouraged by what we find there. 2 Samuel chapter 15 from the English Standard Version. After this, Absalom got himself a chariot and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And when he said, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you." Verse 4. Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were a judge in the land! Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him." Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Verse 7. And at the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." Verse 11. With Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem who were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. Verse 13. And a messenger came to David, saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword." Verse 15. And the king's servants said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides." So the king went out, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. Verse 18. And all his servants passed by him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, passed on before the king. Then the king said to Attai the Gittite, "Why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your home." Verse 20. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us, since I go I know not where? Go back and take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you. But Attai answered the king, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be." Verse 22. And David said to Attai, "Go then, pass on." So Attai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by. And the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. Verse 24. And Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God until the people had all passed out of the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back, and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him." Verse 27. The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Are you not a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your 2 sons, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. Verse 30. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went. And it was told David, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." And David said, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Verse 32. While David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him, with his coat torn and dirt on his head. David said to him, "If you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past,' so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Are not Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? So whatever you hear from the king's house, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their 2 sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send to me everything you hear." So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. Okay, so last time we studied out of chapter 14 the story of Joab calling for a woman of Tekoa to come and present this story to David so that David could see that he could call back Absalom from his exile back to Jerusalem. But it starts off in verse 1. Now Joab the son of Zeruiah knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom, and Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, "Pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak thus to him." So Joab put the words in her mouth. So that's very important for the rest of the story where the woman from Tekoa is present. She's basically an actress that he hired to come in and present this story to David and convince him that justice for her son, that we'll talk about in a moment, would only be served through forgiveness. The woman comes now with a story that Joab had put into her, falls on her face in verse 4, pays homage to the king and says, "Save me, O king." And the king said to her, "What is your trouble?" She says, "Alas, I am a widow, my husband is dead, and your servant has 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him." So she tells this terrible story. She continues in verse 7 that the whole clan had risen up against the surviving son, saying that she should give up this brother, that they could put him to death for the life of the brother whom he killed. And her complaint was that this would destroy her one remaining heir and would quench out the coal that is left for her husband's name, and there would be no remnant on the face of the earth of their family, which was a terrible, terrible thing. And it's a historical recurring theme we see throughout history, the stories of families that terminated because the offspring were suddenly all annihilated. We see it many times in Scripture. We've seen it in our own history. Some of our own cultural stories are motivated by that. Saving Private Ryan comes to mind. And of course, this is a terrible thing to think about for anyone, but especially for a Jewish woman at this particular time in history, this was a very, very terrible thing, because the way that property was divided up in Israel was according to inheritance and according to family division. So every family of the original families that went into the Promised Land got a portion of the property divided to them as a part of the family, and it was supposed to be maintained through the family indefinitely, forever. Even if someone sold land in Israel, it was not permanently sold. It was supposed to be sold only until the next time of reconciliation, which occurred every 7 years, at which time property was returned to the original families, slaves were freed, anything like that was returned to its original state, so that everyone could continue in the inheritance that they had received. So this was a terrible story that this woman brought to David's ear. In verse 8, he's kind of ambivalent toward her complaint and says, "Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you." To me, this is him saying it. He hasn't yet made up his mind. The woman of Tekoa says to the king, "On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house let the king and his throne be guiltless." So she's saying she wants a decision from him in her favor, and if there's guilt to be laid at anyone's feet, let it be laid upon her and her father's house. And the king says, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again." Then she says, "Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son not be destroyed." He said, "As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." So now the king has taken full responsibility for the life of this son, the one who should have been killed by the avenger of blood for the death of the other son. Then the woman said in verse 12, please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. It's a very odd way of conversing to us, but basically she's asking that she be allowed to speak freely. And he says, speak. And the woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. So she's saying, if you're so free to do this with my son, why have you punished your son in such a harsh way? We must all die, she continues in verse 14. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take life away, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. So she's saying that God has made a provision for innocent people who have killed by accident to be part of their culture, even while being responsible for a death. Then she continues her story in verse 15, saying, now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. And your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform this request of his servant, for the king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the heritage of God. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest, for my lord the king is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you. Now all of this has been part of a story that Joab has put in her mouth, but this last little part I think is mostly her trying to spread it on for David here. David picks up on this, on what she says, and I think it's because what she said is true. David is able to discern good and evil. And he says in verse 18, do not hide anything from me, I ask you. And the woman said, let my lord the king speak. So that now that she's had her say, he's asking in return that she be honest with him. And then he says, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? The woman answers and says, as surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has said. So yeah, what I've said is all from Joab. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant. And she says in verse 19, in order to change the course of things, your servant Joab did this. So Joab wanted to correct this behavior, wanted to have David reconcile himself in some way toward Absalom. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. So, and I believe this second time she's saying these flattering things, it is from an honest and true heart. She honestly is amazed that David has worked out that Joab was behind this storytelling. Then the king says to Joab in verse 21, who was apparently present for the whole thing, behold, now I grant this, go bring back the young man Absalom. And Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, and that the king has granted the request of his servant. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. So this is all an interesting thing. So the motivation of Joab from the beginning of chapter 14 seems to be David feeling bad about the whole situation between Absalom and Amnon being dead and Absalom having killed him. So the confusion, I think, historically has been, was David upset that Amnon was dead, or was David upset that Absalom was gone? I think it's both. I think Absalom's fleeing from David upset David probably as much or more than Amnon being dead, because there was good reason for Amnon to have been killed. And all this weighed heavy on David, and Joab knew that and had put this together to convince David that he needed to call Absalom back. Then it has this little break here in verse 25. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. So we have this little break here telling us a little bit more about Absalom. And there are some inconsistencies here that we will address later. But Absalom here is reported to be very handsome, an appealing countenance for people to witness. I did go back and do some reading to double check on some things. And I included Leviticus chapter 20 in my reading for meditation because of the reference there to the law about someone sleeping with his sister. But it is an interesting chapter in many other regards, addressing the depravity of the people of the land that had been in the promised land before Israel took it. These things plagued this land for some reason or another. There always seemed to be a problem, even among God's people, of falling back into this behavior of inappropriate sexual activities, both apart from worship and as a part of worshiping false gods. So I just say that as a footnote here because of what I'm going to suggest about Absalom. But continuing here in verse 28, Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. So the time frame for these stories over these few chapters has been almost 10 years, and if not more. Then Absalom, it says in verse 29, sent for Joab to send him to the king. But Joab wouldn't come, so he tried again, and again Joab wouldn't come. So then he sent his servants into Joab's field, which was next door to his own, and said to them to set the barley there on fire. His servants did that, and Joab came to see Absalom about that, saying, Why have your servants set my field on fire? In verse 31. Absalom answered Joab, Behold, I sent word to you, Come here, that I may send you to the king to ask, Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. So Joab went to the king and told him, and the king summoned Absalom, and he came to the king and bowed down on his face on the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So we see that there is this reconciliation now between David and Absalom, and we begin the story of Absalom's insurrection. After this, Absalom got himself, and starts in chapter 15, a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. So he made a production about going around the town. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And the gate was where everybody came in and out of the city to do business. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call out to him and say, From what city are you? And they would respond, Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel. And Absalom would say to him, See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear them. So there was nobody there immediately available to hear their complaints. They had to go through some other procedure in order to have their complaints heard. It was not readily available to them. Then Absalom would say, Oh, that I were a judge in the land, then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. He didn't have to do anything, but by saying this, it left the impression on everyone who came to town who was already having a bad experience and now was going to have an even more bad experience in presenting their case before the king or whoever the king had designated for them to be heard by. Now they would know that if there had been someone at the gate to meet them, they wouldn't have to do even that. And it left an impression on people. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to him, Absalom, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So we can see how politics can become a problem. God ruled Israel through David, but David was the king appointed by God, and it was not Absalom's place to do what he was doing here. It was inappropriate. And so, I say all that I have said about Absalom, calling this peculiar, about how we've read about him since the beginning of chapter 13. And now I will submit to you my thoughts. Absalom obviously had some intent on the throne of Israel, because that's what we're reading about in chapter 15. It's my supposition that if we read between the lines of all the events that have transpired since the beginning of chapter 13, that Absalom had conspired with Jonadab to present Amnon, who would have been the presumed heir of David's throne, with this plan that would have brought condemnation on Amnon, and that all that had transpired between Absalom and Amnon after he sinned with Tamar was by design of Absalom. Absalom presumed that he could contaminate Amnon with his own lusts, and in fact that's what happened. Amnon needed to die because of what he had done to Tamar. Absalom had used that for his own designs on the throne. He couldn't become king if Amnon was going to be king instead. But by bringing condemnation on Amnon, he could now justify killing Amnon by anyone who looked at the law and saw that in Leviticus chapter 20, anyone who slept with his sister was worthy of death. So this is a possibility that here we have this clever person, Jonadab, working, pushing Amnon just that extra step toward this goal that he had of his sister. Jonadab is there when David hears of all of his sons dying, and he's there to tell David that not all of his sons are dead, only Amnon was dead, and this was by Absalom's command, determined from the day he had violated his sister Tamar, it says in verse 32 of chapter 13. So Jonadab knew well that Absalom had designs on Amnon's death. What else did Jonadab know? What else had been part of that plan? And now we see here in chapter 15, Absalom back in Jerusalem because he had convinced Joab somehow to present himself to the king and ask that Absalom be returned to Jerusalem. And now, having had his plans thwarted for 2 years, he's been able to present himself back into David's favor and is able to walk around Jerusalem unchallenged. And he uses that opportunity to build this relationship with all the people of Israel as they come to Jerusalem to have their cases heard by David's administration. So, it continues in verse 7, that Absalom, after 4 years, said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow which I vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I lived in Geshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord will indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. But he didn't go to Hebron only to worship the Lord. He went to Hebron to declare himself king. Absalom sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, Absalom is king at Hebron." So Absalom wanted to establish himself as king over Israel at Hebron. And Absalom went with 200 men from Jerusalem who were apparently innocent of this. They had no idea what his intentions were, according to verse 11. And he called on Ahithophel the Gilonite, who was David's counselor. And there was this conspiracy now, and it was strong. And the people supported Absalom because of his behaviors in the earlier part of the chapter. So in verse 13, a messenger comes to David, letting him know that the hearts of the men of Israel had gone after Absalom. David said to his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us." So he was fearful that there would be no way for him to get away should Absalom come back immediately with the support of all these Israelites who sought to replace David with Absalom as king. So the servants said that they were ready to go, whatever the Lord decides. And the king went out with all of his household, and he left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out with all the people after him, it says in verse 17, and they halted at the last house. And all of his servants passed by him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath, passed on before the king. So all the people who had served him were now leaving. And now the king says to Ittai the Gittite, and I don't know who Ittai was, but he says to him, why do you also go with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your home. You came only yesterday, and shall I today make you wander about with us, since I go I know not where? So David was not trying to burden this visitor to his land with his troubles, but he told him to go back. But Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king shall be, whether for death or for life, there also will your servant be. So this was a great honor to David by this servant, this man, this Gittite. David said to Ittai, go then, pass on. And Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. And all the land wept aloud as all the people passed by, and the king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. So it was a terrible sight to see David fleeing before his own son from Jerusalem. And Abiathar came up, and behold, Zadok came also with all the Levites, bearing the Ark of the Covenant. So they were going to carry the Ark out of Jerusalem to protect it from Absalom. But David said to Zadok in verse 25, carry the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place. But if he says, I have no pleasure in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me what seems good to him. So David was happy to let the Lord judge him in any manner that he saw fit, but he didn't see the necessity of putting the Ark of the Covenant and the priesthood at risk in his support. The king also said to Zadok the priest, are you not a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your two sons, Ahimaaz your son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar, who were apparently with him as well. See, I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar carried the Ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered. Certainly this has overtones of the story of Christ on the night of his crucifixion. And it was told David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom, which was, I'm sure, very awful news to David. David said, O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Ahithophel was apparently one of the prophets who David relied on for advice. And now David feared that Ahithophel would be an advisor to Absalom in his stead. While David was coming to the summit in verse 32 where God was worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat torn and dirt on his head. And I'm assuming that this meant he was injured in some way. He said, if you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in time past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. So he was sending this man back as a spy for him in the court of Absalom. Are not Zadok and Abiathar the priest with you there? So whatever you hear from the king's house, tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, their two sons are with them there, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send to me everything you hear. So this was a way for him to have this information so that he would not be without knowledge of the things that Ahithophel was advising Absalom of. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. So David's instincts were good. He knew to immediately leave because Absalom was entering the city. Certainly David didn't want to have a fight with Absalom, his son. David's love for people was pure. It was an amazing thing. It made even more amazing because of his failures with Bathsheba and his attitude and treatment of Uriah the Hittite. So it's a terrible story of betrayal, a terrible story of usurpation, a terrible story of politics coming before godliness. It's not a good story, and it's going to continue. So we're going to see more of this in the following chapters I'm telling you, it's amazing how timely some of these stories have been for current events. So please do keep these things in your mind as you go in prayer to God about the situation in the world right now. Please keep all these things in your prayers. We have many brothers and sisters in Ukraine who are suffering, and we should keep them certainly in our prayers. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Please keep our leaders in your prayers as well, that they would lead us in the paths of peace, prosperity, liberty, and righteousness for His name's sake. It's an important thing that our leaders know who God is. These things are certainly heavy on my mind. The similarities between these events in recent history are terribly coincidental. It's not good how similar these things are to what happened prior to World War II and possibly even prior to the events of World War I. That's just not good. We need to be mindful of the threats to our physical circumstance, but also to our spiritual circumstance, perhaps even more so our spiritual circumstance. Many people are suffering. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. Certainly, we will continue with this. I hope you will bear with me as I sprinkled in a few rebroadcasts of previous lessons. We had a lot of technical issues late last year, and I'm hoping that by representing some of the lessons, we will get good versions out on the server for future consumption. Please do remember that we will be meeting at 10 a.m. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.
The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases.